On Friday, the Gauteng North High Court ordered a full reinstatement of the feeding scheme, whether schools are open or not. The court found the access to nutrition was a constitutional right and a crucial part of the right to education. Well, to discuss what this means, I'm joined by the Head of Education for NGO Section 27, Dr. Faranaaz Veriava, one of the organisations that brought the action against government. Good evening, Doctor. You know, the judgment says, if I'm correct, whether schools are open or not, the 9 million children in need must be fed. However, if our schools are closed down again, and we know this is a possibility, will it be logistically possible to feed all these children?
Good evening, Sally, and thank you for having me back on your show. And I also just want to start by mentioning an Oxfam report that came out last week that I found very disturbing, and I think will be very disturbing to your listeners. What it said was that South Africa is one of the new emerging hotspots for hunger under the COVID-19 pandemic. So within that context, to answer your question, we have a structural order in place which says the courts will supervise the rolling out of the school feeding scheme by the department having to report on implementation of the school feeding scheme on a regular basis. It also said that the school feeding scheme is part of the right to basic education as well as the child's right to basic nutrition. Our hope is that government will accept this judgment and will work very hard within the context of what I've just said about hunger to implement the judgment. Should government, however, decide to suspend again on the basis, for example, that it may not be safe, we will not hesitate to go back to court. What I will say is that we know from our expert evidence in court that the scheme the food parcel scheme was not working. Our expert Jeremy Seekings clarified that in his affidavit. Professor Dr. Catherine Hall from the Children's Institute also said that all the other measures were no substitute for the school feeding scheme, which, as I said, currently feeds 9.6 million learners. So we think that the infrastructure is there at schools. It's always been there. We think that the protocols are in place for ensuring or minimizing the risk of infection. And in the interests of ensuring that learners don't go hungry to the extent that they have, and as has been reflected in our affidavits, then we would ask the department to continue to feed whether or not learners are at school.
So I spoke to the Education Department earlier on in this case, and they suggested that the heartbreaking reports of hungry children that you were reading out in court was old news, that they'd already started kicking into action and that they were already instituting these feeding programs. I want to ask you, do you have an assessment of, you say 9.6 million children who actually rely on the Nutrition Schools program for their daily meal? How many of those children are currently getting a meal from that program? Is it possible to estimate?
It's very interesting that you say that, because the day before judgment came out, which was Friday, the department tried to file a supplementary affidavit to say, you see, we actually are trying to roll out the school feeding scheme. But that affidavit that they tried to file in court the day before judgment, which was long after we had argued the case, basically showed that they weren't feeding 9.6 million learners. They said on paper that they were feeding, I think it was approximately about 4 million learners. That was last week, Thursday. I also just want to say that the judge in her judgment said that the department plays hard and loose with the facts, in that what they say on oath doesn't always reflect what they say on the ground. So they may say that, but as of last week, Thursday, they were saying on their version that there were about 4.5 million learners being fed. So I don't think that that is true. And what we will be doing is we will be working with our partners, Equal Education and their equalizers and our client schools. And whatever reports are filed in by the department to court, we will obviously be verifying that against what we are getting on the ground. But so far, what we are getting on the ground is 9.6 million learners are not being fed, and I will put my head on a block with that.
So, in other words, what you're saying, according to the department, less than half those children are actually getting a meal. The judge, I understand, Judge Pottle has given the Education Department and the MECs about 10 days to show what they are doing. But logistically, let's say schools are closed down. Let's look at that scenario. How will those children receive their meal? Will they still have to travel to the school, pick up their food and then go home? Because surely that has safety issues in itself.
Look, there are going to be issues. It's not a perfect situation, but I think a more imperfect situation would be letting 9.6 million learners go hungry. Many countries all over the world have looked at alternatives. Alternatives are things like food vouchers. Gauteng was talking about actually delivering food. Other options are having straddle times for learners to collect food. This will be more likely in the urban areas. In the non-urban areas, you also have things like scholar transport, and scholar transport obviously won't be in use to transport learners, but could be in use to transport food. And I want to say that this would still be a better option than relying on DSD to roll out food parcels. Another thing that Professor Jeremy Seeking said is that more people were being fed before the lockdown than after the lockdown by government. And this is when numbers had actually increased around hunger astronomically. So government has to find alternatives.
It is very worrying, especially what you mentioned earlier about the Oxfam report saying that South Africa is one of the new emerging hunger hotspots for COVID-19. As head of education for your organisation, I just want to ask, what is your view on whether schools should be closed down again? Bearing in mind there is no perfect answer here. There are massive risks either way. What is Section 27's view on whether schools should be closed down again during the peak?
Section 27's view is that we should be guided by the science and what the doctors are saying. And a lot of what they are saying is that you have to weigh the pros and cons on this. And some of the negatives on closing schools down would be things like the school nutrition plan, issues of the mental health of learners. You have to take into consideration that there is learners getting infected at a much lower rate, and at the same time they are more unlikely to be vectors. On the other side, there are obviously concerns about teachers being infected once they're in an environment, but then so doctors, people working in shops, and all other forms of essential workers. So this is something that we have to think of very carefully and weigh. Obviously, whatever decision that's taken, our main interest is ensuring that if they decide that schools are open, then we want to make sure that all the proper protocols are in place to ensure the safety of everybody in the school community. If they decide that schools should be closed, our priority as Section 27 will be to make sure that learners continue to be fed whether or not they are at school. I also just want to say that the judge also noted in her case that schools remain one of the critical points of community interaction, where and where social needs can actually be met compared to any other space in a particular community. So we should also remember that. And even if we're not having people congregate at schools and so forth, there can still be nodes of collection points. So we have to consider that. And it's a difficult thing. And I feel for everybody on all sides. But at the same time, we have to make sure that our people aren't starving.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Head of Education for the NGO's Section 27, Dr. Faranaaz Veriava.